were 15 years. I'm sorry, something just come across my screen then. Yeah. Okay. So I grew up with siblings 10 to 15 years older than me, and they were all the Black Panther age and I'm 8, 9, 10 years of age. So the music of my home was classic R&B. And so I grew up listening to the Temptations, and not the Smokey Robinson Temptations, but the Norman Whitfield, Barrett Strong. That is when Dennis Edwards took over from David Ruffin. So there was a lot of political consciousness then in the Temptations. So at the age of 8 and 9, I'm listening to Puzzle People by the Temptations. And if you've ever listened to that album, it's very politically conscious of the Black Power movement of that era. So you can understand I'm in a household where I look up and there's afros everywhere, you know, all my siblings. And I know I'm light skinned, but I have the rainbow of shades in our family from dark to light, you know, that's just genetically what it is, you know. I thought God was playing tricks on me because he made me very Black conscious, but very light skinned. It can be a burden, right? But that's another element. So just to focus in on Richard's question, I grew up in a household of Black culture from a musical perspective. And once you start listening to, you know, to James Brown, Bob Marley, the Temptations, the Isley Brothers, you know, Harvest for the World, you're being educated. Bob Marley was a teacher as well as a musician, and I'm being educated by all this music indirectly. And so my brothers were in vocal groups. So other Black Liverpudlians would join them and start groups. So to cut a long story short, I grew up in Black British culture with a very strong African-American element via music. And I began to really, it became a labor of love, the African-American experience for me, being in Britain. And my first hero was Muhammad Ali, who taught me to look after my body and stay fit. And another hero of mine was Pele, the footballer, real football, you know, real football. You play with your feet. Okay, so then, and I had Stevie Wonder as an overall musician who I loved. So consciously, self-esteem and all of these other things that a lot of Black kids don't have, I was surrounded by it. So I never had a problem being of Black heritage. In fact, it was something to be very, very proud of. But again, I think it was the household I was in, so many siblings talking about Black culture, and my brothers being involved in music, you know. So I think that's the key. The schooling experience I had wasn't very good. But then when I read Malcolm X's autobiography, I noticed that he was also in a class, and he was the only Black kid in the class. And I had that experience in Liverpool, England. So you know, it's strange because we think of the African-American experience as millions of African-Americans, but the split and dispersed as well. There can be dispersed experiences. So after reading Malcolm X's autobiography, I understood that teacher experience, because I wasn't emboldened by my teachers at school to be a writer. It wasn't until I went to a place called the Charles Wooten Center, which was a place set up for Black Liverpudlians who hadn't done well in the education system. And that's where I got my first Black studies teacher. And I was 19 by then, age 19. And that's when I got taught about Marcus Garvey and also Karl Marx. There's a lot of Marxist Black scholars back in the day there. But my first teacher was a guy called Ron Babatunde Phillips, who was a Pan-Africanist. And he was the first to say, he wrote in one of his books, he said, you know, to the youth and for your future writing, Mark, you know, and that gave me, you know, that filled me with confidence as a teenager. And then I began to write some poetry, and I began to write songs and sing with my brothers, play football, and study Black history and culture. That is, in essence, my background, you see. And having so many siblings, I didn't have a problem with self-esteem as a Black individual, though racism was everywhere, you know.
So one of the things you talk about in the most recent book, Transatlantic Liverpool, Shades of the Black Atlantic, and as I had said in the introduction and just earlier, we could go in any direction for hours and hours, but you use, and this is my language, so please correct me, but you use kind of a semi-autobiographical writing style similar to, I don't know, Martin King, Malcolm X, to kind of not just simply reveal what your truths are, but to really put it in the greater context of understanding for those of us that weren't familiar with the rich tradition of Black life in Liverpool, the larger settlements in the history. So would you talk about your approach to writing this book and how important it was for you to begin to both tell a personal narrative, but also to tie it into historically and globally as well? Okay,
thank you, Richard. The book is something I've experienced for most of my life, so it was easy to write, but very difficult to write as well. It was because I've been away from Liverpool. I've lived over here now in the States since 2000, so I was far enough away to see the past in more analytical terms. And I wrote about the Liverpool Black experience within the context of the Black Atlantic paradigm, the transatlantic triangle that we're all involved with, that we're all connected to. And I talk about my father taking that journey in 1941 from Jamaica to England and crossing the Atlantic when U-boats were blowing up merchant Navy ships, which he was on. So that's the journey of my father into Liverpool. But then I go back as well to the history of the city itself, which is a slave port. I mean, one of the most prominent slave ports. In fact, it had the monopoly on slave shipping in its day in the 1700s. A lot of people don't know about this history because the British historians have kind of padded it down. Do you know, like, what is happening now with the African American studies in this society, where people are politically trying to dampen down the articulation of the African American experience, which for me is horrendous. But that has happened in a more subtle way back in England. The suppression of Black history in Liverpool has been quite profound. And I came along to, you know, I always said to myself, I will write our history. And I've reached the stage where I could do that. And I integrated myself into the narrative via my family, because our family have gained some fame, if you like, quote unquote, small fame through music, through singing. And I used the family experience to articulate the broader Liverpool Black experience and the grassroots scene of education, football, that galvanized the community. It's also a Creole community, because the vast majority of Black people that came into this city were African males or African descent, seamen, soldiers, munitions workers. That kind of transatlantic population came into the city, married locally, integrated with Black women, by the way, as well as white women. So there's this Creole kind of experience in the city of Liverpool. It's also renowned as one of the arguably the oldest Black community in Europe as well, Liverpool, England. Now, in terms of the writing of Black British history, it's been dominated by the likes of Gilroy, Paul Gilroy, and Stuart Hall. If you don't know this, Paul Gilroy was the student of Stuart Hall, who's from Jamaica, and he settled in London and Birmingham, the cities of London and Birmingham. Now, when they write largely from a London-centric perspective. I understand over here this situation of London, because when I did my master's at Ohio State in Black Studies in 1992-93, all my peers would introduce me to their friends as, this is Mark, he's from London. You see, that was how they would perceive the British scene. This is Mark from London. Well, I'm not, I'm from Liverpool, you see? So it's a totally different city and a different experience. But I understand how that works, you see, because London is such a prominent city. So when I wrote this book, I have it here, by the way. Those of you who may not have seen it. I don't know whether, yeah, this is, now look, this is in the Garvey colors surrounding, but I've got there's some symbolicness here. There's a black world surrounded by whiteness, because the ghost of whiteness always follows us in the African diaspora. No matter what we're doing, the ghost is always hovering somewhere in our, behind us as we write and all of these other things. I think you all know that. So that's the symbolism. So when I was writing this book, I tried to tell it from the perspective of the Black Liverpool experience, but put it in the context of the Black Atlantic paradigm that misses all of these other cities besides London, you see. And Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic, I think you may have heard of it, that came out in 1993. And it's been a prominent text for 3 decades. And it's been the dominant text of Black British experience. And I've been very critical of that aspect, because there's a lot more to the Black British experience. And he never mentions Liverpool. If you look in the index, Liverpool as a city is not even mentioned. And as Richard said earlier, his idea of Liverpool is the Beatles, Paul McCartney, John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. And that is the experience I've had over here in the United States. When people know I'm from Liverpool, the Beatles come up, you see. So, and I understand that, that's it. But the city was based, its wealth is based on the enslavement experience, and the ships coming into that port was the wealth, and African lives. And I speak about this in the book. I talk about, you've all heard of the Zong slave ship? Well, that came out of Liverpool. That's a slave ship that had threw Africans overboard in order to get the insurance money. I don't know whether you've ever heard of that, but if you Google it, the Zong, Z-O-N-G, that's a slave ship from, I think it's 1781-ish. And it came from Africa. They were running out of water, apparently, and decided to throw Africans overboard in order to get the insurance money. Big case. But what's missing is that ship actually came from Liverpool, England. And you've seen the other ship, the slave ship Brooks, the Brooks, where they do the Africans packed like sardines. Have you ever seen that diagram of a slave ship? Anybody nodding? Yeah, I see you nodding. So you've seen that slave ship diagram where all Africans are packed like sardines. That is a slave ship that came from Liverpool too. So two major case studies that it's hidden in history. largely hidden that the city of Liverpool is responsible for those slave ships. Some great scholars have come over to Liverpool and to speak at the slavery remembrance. We have a museum in Liverpool dedicated to international and remembrance of enslavement. And the first person to open it in 1994 was Maya Angelou. I met her in a black bookstore 3 years earlier in 1991 in Liverpool 8, the black community. Maya Angelou, I sang a cappella to Maya Angelou, not very good because I was nervous, Maya Angelou, and she signed her book, one of her books for me. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, 1991. She opens up the museum in 1994. The museum name was changed in 2007, and Jesse Jackson came over to open it. The reason I'm saying this is that there's been this connection between the African-American experience in Liverpool that is profound. In fact, I came to the United States because an African-American came over. His name is Dr. William Nelson Jr., my mentor from Ohio State. He was doing research on Black politics in Liverpool, and that's how I met him. And he said, "You got to come over to the States, Mark, and do a master's. We got loads of Black studies called. We got 90 Black studies classes, man. You got to come over, Mark. You got to come over." This is how Dr. Nelson used to speak. And I grabbed that opportunity, and that's how I got to the United States. But that was an African-American scholar doing a transatlantic study of Boston and Liverpool, you see? So I also talk in the book about Frederick Douglass. I don't know whether you study history, but Frederick Douglass, his first book from 1845, his first autobiography, he left the United States because he was in trouble. He was a fugitive, and he came to Britain, and his first port was Liverpool. And from Liverpool, he went all around Britain speaking and became a star, Frederick Douglass. And there was a group of abolitionists who raised the money for his freedom and paid off Thomas Auld, the so-called master. So Frederick Douglass, when he came back to America in 1847, he was a free man, quote unquote, yeah? He was no longer an enslaved African-American. And that's when he set up the North Star, again with help from British abolitionists. So there's so much history that's connected to us and via the transatlantic experience that I connected to this latest book.
I'm going to throw a quick question in there, and then we're going to shift to Booker T, and then we're going to open it up to others. And probably we've already said a mouthful for questions and comments already. But the quick question I want to ask you, you call your own writing kind of an evocative prose. I would say it's emancipatory, liberation-oriented prose, where, in my opinion, you don't have to be apologetic to anybody when you're seeking to tell truth. But the question I want to ask you, as you reference artists that I wasn't familiar with until I did a little homework based on what you wrote about and talk about, Levi Tafari, Benjamin Zephaniah, and others who are of that tradition. Yes. Would you share why you think it's important for, Africans abroad to hear a critique of the monarchy, the death of the Queen, that's other than the more rah-rah oriented critique that we both get in this country, from America and in England? Would you share a little bit about your perspective of some of that?
Well, Benjamin Zephaniah, great poet. Again, he came from Jamaica at the age of 10, and he graduated from a university in London in 1973. Benjamin Zephaniah is a brilliant poet, dub poet, and he has a poem. The reason I'm talking about him is, and I'm sorry now, I have to say the name of his poem. So for those of you who are sensitive to words, you'll have to close your ears, because he calls his poem "England is a Bitch," which is a kind of a Jamaican patois. England is a bitch, you know, because of the. Now, let me explain that for Benjamin in the best way I can. What he's saying is the racism that's been impacted on Black Britons was so profound in his day. That's how he wrote a poem. So it sounds disrespectful to many, but if you understand it from the Black British experience, you'll understand Benjamin's Afanaya's perspective. Levi Tafari, also of Jamaican heritage, but raised in Liverpool, England, like myself. I call him the Black Poet Laureate of Liverpool, you know, and he's still there now, and he's articulated his experience of being in Liverpool, England, and growing up. And I cite one of his poems in the book, where he said, you know, it talks again about the experience of Black people. We don't know how we've survived. There was a report on the Black experience in Liverpool in 1989. And the reporters said, it's so bad, it has to be deemed uniquely horrific. You know, there was a report on education, for example. I speak British. I was born and raised in Liverpool, so I know the British culture. Many of my friends do, thousands of us do. But they did an educational report in 1985, and they found the experience of Black Liverpudlians. That's what I would be described as in some quarters, a Black Liverpudlian. They have another phrase called Scouser, right? You're a Black Scouser. It means you're raised in Liverpool from a Black heritage. But the government, and this is a government report on education, they said the experience of Blacks in Liverpool is so bad, we had to single out a chapter for them, having this very negative experience in the British education system. You see, so I'm going back to that experience that I had, but on a broader level, that it's not just me. We're not just experiencing this on our own. So back to Richard's question about royalty. We Liverpool people generally, that's any color, any culture, don't have, there are many who do, by the way, there are many who do love the royals, but there is also a very strong element of working class, a kind of anti-royal, or they're not deemed in esteem as they are over here or in some areas of Britain. You see, Liverpool is such a unique city. It's kind of has a working class element. That humor that came from the Beatles is a very Liverpool experience. You know, it's unique, a bit like New Yorkers. John Lennon said he likes New York because it reminds him of Liverpool. So when I speak to a real down and out New Yorker, I do sense that honesty, that salt of the earth kind of attitude that I recall in Liverpool, England as well, you see. So we don't, if you get above yourself in Liverpool, you get knocked down. You know, you have to keep your feet on the ground, otherwise you'll be called an idiot, a fool, you know. And so we look at royalty as like, they're just privileged welfare recipients, you know, because it's taxpayers' money that keeps the royal family going. So I don't want to go too deep into that, but I think you get the gist. Also, in terms of race and the royal family, there was a time that the royal family was seen as the apex of white supremacy. I'm not sure whether you're aware of that. And what's very ironic is that they have Black heritage in the royal family. And now we have it with Meghan Markle, and it's causing a lot of controversy. And the racism that she received She had to get out of Britain to survive. But if you go back to Queen Charlotte, Queen Charlotte was the wife of George III, the crazy guy who was in charge of Britain when you guys gave up the, went for independence in 1776. Well, George III was mentally disturbed, but his wife was Queen Charlotte, was a woman of color through Portuguese heritage, Black, African, Portuguese, mixed heritage, but still African diaspora, So there is, if you look closely at the Queen who died, Queen Elizabeth, and her features, you'll see some Black heritage there. Look at Queen Elizabeth II, and then take a picture of Freddie Washington, who was an African-American actress in the turn of the early 20th century. She's very light-skinned, but she could be the sister of the Queen, So race is problematic if you look at it visually. We are connected more than they think we are, And so Liverpool people tend to be working class, don't look up to hierarchy with reverence. And when you're ingrained in that experience, that social experience, it does have an impact on your attitude in life. We're very down to earth people from Liverpool, generally speaking. Yeah.
See, and I appreciate that, Mark. And as I have said in this format and elsewhere, if speaking for myself and the gent, if we can't tell our own truth in the Ngoma conversations, I don't want to have them.
Right.
So if people have a problem with a critique or a different framework or knowledge base, do your homework, but just don't give me an emotional reaction to it because it's new and you've not heard it before. Because quite frankly, I don't have time for an emotional reaction from folks that oftentimes have such a reaction because of their own ignorance and the hegemonic discourse that they've been taught themselves. I'm moving to Booker T. Washington. Go ahead if you have a comment.
Richard, can I just respond to something that you've raised indirectly? The reason I had to write that kind of a semi-apology for my evocative language within the context of that book is because I had an editor from Kentucky who was about 22 years of age, graduated with an English degree from a small college in Kentucky, who was telling me not to write jingoistic for Margaret Thatcher. And I was told not to use Tarzan for Michael Heseltine. Well, these are politicians from the British experience. Tarzan, Michael Heseltine, that was his nickname that he created. And I was told by an editor and I had to say to this editor, you don't know what I'm writing about. And then and jingoistic was kept in for Thatcher. That's a basic word for her. She was extremely jingoistic, and Tarzan was related to Tarzan Michael Heseltine. That was his name. I'm giving you just two examples of what we have to deal with as Black writers dealing with mainstream publishers, which is Lexington, Rowman, Littlefield. Now, I'm speaking about this because it's the truth, it's, and I'm very passionate about it. In fact, I think we need to have a book called Writing While Black, Writing While Black, because most of the time we put a book proposal to an editor, even if it's African-American studies, there's a white editor, a gatekeeper that we have to pass through. So, this is Richard just raised something that I wasn't even going to speak about, but I had to write that in the preface to get past this editor who was just out of college as well. And I'm scratching my head and I'm saying, well, why is she an editor for critical Africana studies? And that's what we have to go through. Amari Baraka called it the ghost hovering around us. Toni Morrison calls it the white gaze. And Toni Morrison explained that James Baldwin said, there's a little white guy on my shoulder as I write. There's a little white guy standing on my shoulder, you know, meaning we've always got to think of this ghost. I prefer Amari Baraka's or Toni Morrison's The White Gaze. And you know, we as writers, as Black writers who want to articulate our experiences, often have to pass through gatekeepers who do not even understand the basics of how we think, what we've experienced, and how we want to articulate ideas. They're always thinking of reverse racism. You know, raise the white liberal issue, and you're going to be in you're going to be in a lot of trouble, because I'll stop there.
Hey, let me say this, brother. One question, then we're going to open it up. Ngoma conversations are supposed to stir up the pot and beat the drum. So the agenda is fine as far as I'm concerned. And if not, it was nice working with you. And I'll you know, we got to do what we got to do, brother.
We got to do what we've got to do.
We got to do what we got to do. Speak truth to power, you know.
Yeah.
As Karenga says, rescue me if I'm wrong. You know, that's
right.
That's what we do. That's who we are, and that's what we do. Quick question. Really, Go ahead. Okay. And there's a lot of chat questions too. So quick question. And then we're going to open it up. Go ahead.
I'm concerned about the younger writers, because I'm a senior scholar now. And if I can come across that, a younger writer will lean back even more and shave down what they really want to articulate, because they want to get published. You know, if you're a young professor, that's why you know what? I've begun to understand us. We are the 1940s, 1950s Black singers being ripped off by the record companies. We don't get paid much. We give all our artwork to these folks. We have to pay for the index. You know, they do as little as we could do 90% of the copy editing now. So the Black writer in the modern context is being ripped off like the 1940s and 1950s singers in R&B. They used to call them race records back then.
Race records. And part of my era, actually in the 60s and 70s as well. A quick question, we're going to open it up. So talk about why you use the term and what it means for you of how Booker T. Washington has been fossilized and what that means and why you write about that.
That's a great question. This is, let me show you the book. This is an autobiography of Booker T. Washington. It's called The Life in American History. Really thoroughly enjoyed it. I drank the Kool-Aid of the scholarship that deemed Booker T. Washington somebody who gave up on politics, somebody who was, you know that phrase, Uncle Tom, very disparaging against Booker T. Washington. And I have to say, as a young scholar, I read the work available tended to be in that framework. That's what I meant by fossilized. He seems to have been fossilized into this framework of being an Uncle Tom. And it's a very disparaging. I went deep into his life. I went deep into the Booker T. Washington papers. I read the autobiographies, the existing, and I found so much problems. And as much as I love W.E.B. Du Bois, in relation to how he wrote about Booker T. Washington and their relationship, I have to say I found mendacity there, you know, and I found problematic aspects of Du Bois. But I love the guy, you know, I love W.E.B. Du Bois. But in relation to Booker T. Washington, I see some problems. Now, I'll say the first thing. When Booker T. Washington was at his height, 1890s, W.E.B. was just coming out of Harvard. Yes, he'd cracked that ceiling and got the PhD in history, and he was a brilliant scholar. But in terms of his meeting with Booker T. Washington, they're not on the same level. Booker T. Washington had built an institute of higher learning by this time. He was 12 years the senior of W.E.B., had a totally different experience because he was born out of enslavement. He spent the first 9 years of his life in enslavement, whereas W.E.B. was born outside of enslavement in 1868. So he grew up also in Massachusetts, outside of the worst, the harshness of enslavement. So the two, when we read them as scholars today, we see Booker T. Washington's ideas versus W.E.B. as if they're on a level. But if you look at the nuance of it, they are far from on a level in age, experience, and circumstance. Booker T. Washington, when Du Bois, it's easy to write from the North, criticizing someone in the South. Think about this. Booker T. Washington had the responsibility of an institution with 1,000 students and about 200 faculty and staff by the turn of the 20th century. That is a lot of responsibility on your shoulders in the deep South, the Black Belt. How he could articulate criticism towards white supremacy is far different than somebody writing in a journal in the North, safe in New York, or even in Atlanta. You're much safer than in Alabama. But there's more than this. I looked at each area, politics, I looked at segregation, and in each area, Booker T. Washington was doing work behind the scenes. He couldn't do it up front because that would be tantamount to suicide and his institution being burnt to the ground. And you know they would have done that, don't you? You are aware that they would have lynched him and burnt his institution to the ground had he been openly critical about white supremacy. And in the South, he had responsibility. He couldn't do things openly, but he did do things behind the scenes. Another critique from W.E.B. was he was in the hands of white financiers. Booker T. Washington became friendly with the northern businessmen. And to the extent where he spoke at their funerals, he was invited to Skybow Castle of Andrew Carnegie's. The race became secondary. Andrew Carnegie came from a very, very poor Scottish background. And he said to Booker T, you know, as hard as it was for me, you had the added issue of race in your experience. So I really admire what you've done. They got on a different level when they begin to talk to each other. Now, look, because we don't have the time, Booker T. Washington was close to some of those guys. Julius Rosenwald is another. He brought 5,000 schools into the South, elementary schools, and it was Booker T. Washington who helped disperse the schools and the funding. Booker T. Washington was supposed to be against liberal arts. He was on the trustee board of Fisk and Howard. Do you know who he was the mentor of? In a Harlem Renaissance major philosopher, Alain Locke. I have a letter in this, you know, in the primary documents. I have a letter from Alain Locke, who would be the philosopher of the Harlem Renaissance, major liberal arts scholar, thanking Booker T. Washington for the work he did for him getting his first job at Howard University. He thought, I've got the letter there, and I'll do anything. Thank you, Mr. Washington. You know, very, very grateful. He was a liberal arts. Liberal arts was always taught at Tuskegee. Yes, there was a vocational element because Booker T. Washington was a very practical man, and African Americans at that time needed jobs. They needed their community built. He believed in thrift, you know, save some money, buy your home. When you're strong, then your children may go out to college or wherever, but you've got to get the economic base in place. Last thing to support Booker T. Washington and the critique, he inspired Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey is probably the most radical Black guy in the African diaspora in the early 20th century. Without Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey wouldn't have come over here. Marcus Garvey came over in 2016 and Booker T had died in November of 2015, but he came over here to raise funds to go and build a Tuskegee school in Jamaica. That's all he wanted to do, having read and understood Booker T. Washington's agenda. Also, Booker T. Washington was one of the first, he had students coming over from Africa and African Americans going to Africa in the early 20th century. Nobody knows that. So he's not even deemed a Pan-Africanist. There was students coming from the African Caribbean to study at Tuskegee. So he was doing study abroad in the African diaspora and African continent way before anybody else. Doesn't get the credit for it. Last thing, last point. W.E.B., I found a letter from W.E.B. writing to Andrew Carnegie asking him for money for his Atlanta project. I've got no problem with that. But then when you use that same paradigm against Booker T. Washington, it's a little unfair and it's a little mendacious because, and the letter's there and it's in his, what do the people say? If you want to hide a fact from Africans, put it in a book. You know, not enough of us are reading and taking out all the information, and we just take what's in a textbook and just carry it on through. And that relationship between Du Bois and Washington needs to be reevaluated. And I'm not taking any away from W.E.B. because he's a brilliant fellow in his own right. But Booker T. Washington is massively misunderstood and massively fossilized. So.
Excellent. So I want to, so there's been a lively conversation streaming through on the chat, and I want to come directly to the questions and comments. Dr. Celeste Johnson, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, this is just a quick comment and just to say thank you so much. People are going to wonder why I'm still walking on the planet when I say this, but my dad died at 100 years old. I just retired, and he went to Tuskegee in the earlier years, somewhat earlier years. And I grew up with not Jesus, Martin Luther King and JFK, but I grew up with Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. You had pictures of those. And while it was certainly at a much simpler level, I'm going to get your book and read it because this is so exciting. And I have to say, it's so exciting to hear someone talk about the complexity, actually of both the guys, but certainly of Booker T. Washington. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I have a chapter called of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois and Others, which is, I'm playing off W.E.B. Du Bois's chapter in The Souls of Black Folk, of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others. Now, there's a subtlety there because Du Bois is kind of tongue-in-cheek because he says Mr. Washington and others. And by this time, he'd had a doctorate, honorary doctorate, but he was called Dr. Washington, Booker T, but by this time, by the early 20th century. So to call him Mr. Washington is a little, you know, that's another nuance. And I found some problems with Du Bois in his writing because he shaped how we would see Booker T going right up, because the scholars, the acolytes of Du Bois were all leftist Marxists, and they kind of pushed through this stereotype of Booker T. Washington. And it's always great to meet somebody who come out of Tuskegee, because there is the living legacy. I was at a beautiful conference the other week called History Makers, led by Juliana Richardson. She's done some great work in archiving the history of African Americans. And I met a faculty member of Tuskegee and two students, current students, and I got very excited because I said, do you know your Booker T. Washington's legacy? You're living the legacy. You know, Booker T. Washington never took any money. He poured it all back into the institution. Even his family were a little upset over that, you know. Carnegie gave him $600,000 for a library, but his salary, and he wouldn't take salary. You know, he built the library, and it's just a beautiful fellow, Booker T. Washington. I have nothing but respect for the man, you know.
Excellent. We're going to jump in there with Professor Carly King's question, followed by Dr. Tim Taylor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christian and Dr. Cooper, for the space and conversation. Dr. Christian, I'm thinking so much about, even as Celeste just shared, as Dr. Johnson just shared, the complexities that you're exploring with us today. And yeah. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about even how we continue to share this knowledge about the diaspora and our experience across the diaspora and all African folks, particularly in this US context when we have states like Florida that are banning US history right now. How do we continue to have these conversations in spaces where it's not hidden, it's not shared in such a monolith way, or as we said, pitting Du Bois versus Dr. Booker? And I just love so much this conversation that you're having, but I'm thinking about all the complexities of education in this current time.
Well, I have a picture of Frederick Douglass in my corridor as I leave. As I leave my home and as I come back, I meet with Frederick Douglass. I say, hello, Frederick, And I always say, whatever problem I'm having personally, whether it's at the workplace or in the personal life, whatever problems, and there's many that we each and every day face, that's the reality of life. Life is a series of challenges. My mother used to say, Mark, every one of us will face some tragedy in our lives. Nobody escapes it. Health, divorce, death. Something's going to happen in every one of our lives, and you don't know what people are going through. That's the first thing. We need to be kind to each other. In terms of our world, what Richard does, what I do, what you will do, that's keeping the history alive, what we do. This Florida thing, really, what it does, it shines a light on what we've always experienced. I'm in Black Studies, and I've always experienced pushback from the mainstream of education, ignored on emails, those little microaggressions, what you're doing is unworthy, You've got to have a thick skin. You've got to develop a thick skin. But I know as a younger scholar, that's easier said than done, because you have to go over hurdles if you're going for promotion, if you're doing whatever it is you're doing. We are always up against these forces, the white ghost. To keep our work alive, you have to keep doing your work. What Richard's doing, I've only walked into this today, but what he's doing clearly is quite brilliant, and the university where he is very, very fortunate to have him. But he's always been a technical kind of guy. I'm not very technical. I don't use social media, but I think I've got 3 books because I don't use social media, you see? So there's this balance. And you know what else I say? Not every one of us can be a politician. Not everybody can think like I think. Not everybody can think the way each of you think. So Malcolm used to say, hey, don't be quick to criticize. There was a time you didn't know what you know now. it's a beautiful phrase that from Malcolm X, because he was a brilliant thinker. And he's saying, be patient with each other, because most of us are at different levels of consciousness. We're in a marathon race. And by the time we finish our marathon, we just have to pass the baton, because we'll only get so far. Each of us, we cannot carry the world on our shoulders because it's too heavy. You know, it's too heavy for any one of us. And this is what I say, you've got to see our experience as a mosaic. And if it's what you love as African American studies, and I know you can do something in this field if that's your love. If you're in education, teaching broad education, it's going to be difficult for you, because they're gonna tell you to teach this and that, and then you're gonna have to squeeze in African American studies. Florida shines a light on what's been happening for decades to African American studies. And it's good, that's a good thing, because now everybody can see, a bit like George Floyd experience, you know, as tragic and as heinous as that was, we saw it. Nobody could deny it. Now we've got Tyre Nichols' situation, and people are confused. I'm not confused, because I know self-hatred among us is very prominent. And when a black man is hitting another black man in that ferocity, in that manner, that is self-hatred, whether he realizes it or not.
Now, I want to pause you there. I want to take these two questions, and so don't take it personally. Some people have to run and teach, so we thank everybody for coming. We'll be back next month, third Monday of the month, and get ready for it. We're going to take our two final questions. We are recording this, and we will share the link on YouTube. So I want to go next to Dr. Tanya, followed by our own Dr. Lola Ames. Dr. Tanya.
Oh, so glad to be here. Thank you, for taking my question. I know we got brief time, so thank you so much for the information that you shared about Liverpool. Now, I've already put on Facebook, oh, y'all got to know the history of Liverpool. So just already know it's already moved that. I'm not, thank you. But I want to ask you something. Do you believe that Booker T. Washington was fossilized because in essence, he talked about economic development in a capitalist nation, whereas as Wyatt Rustin would say, some of these aspects like of the boys, what he talked about was really social. And Wyatt Rustin would later say in one essay that that's really like a lot of the low hanging fruit, but that's the one that we always concentrate on. Do you think that basically fossilizing Booker T. Washington also helped to neutralize really our economic development wealth, which today results into a massive race equity gap?
That's brilliant. Your comment is brilliant, and you're absolutely right in the sense that the scholars that fossilized Booker T was mainly because he stood within a capitalist framework of understanding economic development. And I don't think even Du Bois came to Karl Marx much later on in life. You know, he didn't study him in depth, probably until Black Reconstruction, and even then, it's not die-hard Marxist analysis. But the man, I'm going to point the finger at the man is Herbert Aptheker, who did some very good work, by the way, in documenting Black African-American rebellion. But when it comes to Booker T. Washington, he helped frame the fossilization of Booker T. Washington. And Herbert Aptheker was a die-hard Marxist scholar, you know. Now, you know, am I against Marxism? Am I a Black conservative? No, I'm an independent thinker. And if you want to put me in line with another African-American thinker on this issue, I would point you to Ishmael Reed. Ishmael Reed is an independent thinker, a great writer in African-American literature, but he wrote a brilliant intro to a 2010 edition of Up From Slavery. So take a note of that, 2010, Up From Slavery, The Introduction by Ishmael Reed, because it's out there, and read his analysis of the critique of Booker T. Washington. It's right down the path that the young professor just came at me with. And it's basically, he was disliked because he took on a capitalist framework. What else could he do? What else could Booker T. Washington do? I mean, everything he did was grassroots socialism, really. Was to empower the community below him, get basic education moving, and then get higher into a more prosperous position. You have to start somewhere. Even the great Marxist scholar Walter Rodney said that we have to use war of position. We have to use the tools we've got and move into a position of strength. So to just disregard Booker T. Washington's economic philosophy has been very, very dangerous. I still follow him today. I've got savings in the bank. My home is paid for. And I have a little bit of leeway. That's just following the philosophy of Booker T. Washington. Nothing, very simple. Save some, spend some. And buy your property as quickly as possible, because one of the biggest rip-offs in American society, I'm British, is the mortgage. The mortgage, we pay 3 times what the house is worth via a mortgage. Okay, you get some equity, but so I'm going into economics there, a little bit personal, but Booker T. Washington, yes, he was critiqued because of his economic philosophy, which was very, very important. He paid for the land of where Tuskegee is. Did you know it was a plantation? Yeah, the land that Tuskegee sits on was a plantation. He bought it for $500 back in the day, which was a lot of money. Had to borrow the money and pay it back, but Tuskegee is paid for. That's very sound economic.
And our final comment and question comes from our own Dr. Lola Ames. Dr. Ames.
I just want to say thank you for the insight into Dr. Booker T. Washington, because I've been pulling my hair out and I'm like, I can't be the only one that thinks like this. Right. I can't be the only one, so I just want to thank you for validating my thoughts on Booker T. Washington. Thank you very much. Thank
you. I got into Booker T through Marcus Garvey. Mm-hmm. And I thought, if he's good enough for Garvey, then he's good enough. Let me have a close look here. Mm-hmm. That's how I thought.
Please.
Wow. Yeah.
Excellent. So as we said at the top of this, Dr. Mark Christian, that this is going to be a teaser, an introduction to your scholarship, to your prophetic thinking and insights. We will definitely have you back. But let me just say, there was a lot of buzz in the chats thanking you. Some people had to run out to teach. This is recorded and we'll upload it. I started it a little late, but this will be uploaded into YouTube. And brother, doctor, I appreciate you so much. And I hope we can stay connected and hopefully get together. You Definitely. And I, and then another one of these.
Definitely, Richard. Thanks so much for inviting me, and thank you all of the participants. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. So again, thanks everybody for attending. You can see that sometimes the stars line up and the ancestors line up, and we had the speaker we were supposed to have for Black History Month. Here he is, Dr. Mark Christian. I want to thank you again. I want to thank all of you for coming out. Stay tuned for the third Monday of the month. 12 to 1, where we will have another speaker and another topic. And again, take care, everybody. Have a good rest of the day. Stay strong, brother. I will follow up with a call soon.
Yes. Thank you.
All right. Be well.